I'm Laura Lockhart. Welcome to the Reader's Digest Sewing Studio. These days, more and more people are discovering how satisfying home sewing can be. It's one of those rare creative activities you can do almost whenever and wherever you choose. Something you can pick up and put down at your convenience. And there's no great mystery about it. Sewing by hand or by machine is a skill that you can learn step by step. Then you can browse through a catalog, choose something you like, stop at a fabric store, and do the rest in your spare time. You can put those in-between moments to use, making beautiful things for yourself, your family, your home, even gifts for your friends, at less than it would cost to buy them already made. In this program, we're going to show you everything you need to know to sew successfully. From setting up a sewing area in your home, to using your sewing machine and making the most of all its features. We'll guide you through the basic sewing techniques. Now in this program, you will see us sewing on flat fabric samples or parts of garments. But these are the very same techniques you will use in sewing clothes, as well as things for your home. We've arranged the material in step-by-step sections, just like a series of easy lessons. You'll find them in the booklet that came with this program. The sections are also numbered on your screen, and these numbers appear in the index of your viewer's guide booklet. It'll be easy for you to view each section, stop the program, and try your hand, again and again, practicing at your own pace until you've mastered each technique. Anytime you want to refresh your memory, or whenever you begin a new sewing project, you can go back and do a quick review. Now, let's get started. The next section, setting up your sewing space, is about basic tools and notions. If you already know all about that, and it's your machine you're interested in, you can fast forward directly to that portion of the program, or any other chapter shown in this menu. These and smaller segments of the tape are also indexed in your booklet. Here in our studio, the sewing area is tailored specifically to our needs. But for most of us who sew at home, a spare room or just a section of a room is all the space available to us. Most people improvise. The first thing to consider is a space for your sewing machine. Most of today's machines are sealed at the bottom, so you can set them on top of a table. Just make sure that the table is strong and steady, with enough surface for your fabric as well as your machine. You'll need to work at a comfortable height. On top of a table, the machine will add 3 inches to the height of your work surface. This sewing table is built for today's new machines. It has an adjustable surface. It's flat when we need the workspace and sewing area to support our fabric. But this section slides away to allow us full access to all parts of the machine. There are some excellent sewing cabinets that combine sewing surface and storage space. They can be costly, but if you have the room, a sewing machine cabinet may be ideal for your needs. Next, you'll need a comfortable chair, one that offers proper support and the right height for working. Most machines come with a small light built into the unit. However, this light alone is not enough for detailed work. Try to take advantage of natural light. Set your machine table next to a window if you can, and position a lamp so that your working area is generously lit, free from shadows and glare. A full-length mirror is a necessity when you're taking measurements and fitting a garment. A good mirror doesn't have to be expensive. You probably have one already behind a closet door. If not, that's an inconspicuous place to hang your mirror. A dress form made to your shape is an investment not absolutely necessary, but it's invaluable if you intend to make clothes that fit well. You can find an adjustable dress form at your fabric store. The booklet that accompanies this program contains information on ordering a dress form made to your figure. You'll also need a place for cutting and handling your fabric. A surface about 3 feet by 5 feet should be fine. This cutting table is designed for our use. It's 36 inches high, but you can certainly use your dining room table. Just be sure to cover it first with firm table pads to protect the surface. Remember, under normal circumstances, you'll need your cutting table only at the start of a project, when you're laying out your fabric, pinning, marking, and cutting out your pattern. If you use a cutting board, as many sewers like to do, once you've cut your pattern pieces, you can fold it up and put it away. You'll soon discover that one of the secrets of sewing is pressing. That's the way to give your sewing a professional look. So it's best if all your pressing equipment can be set up near your sewing area. A good steam iron and a stable padded ironing board are essential. Here are some other useful pressing tools which you should be able to find at your fabric store. A seam roll is a firmly packed cylindrical cushion. It's covered with wool on one side so it can hold steam as you press your wool fabrics, and cotton on the other side for pressing all other fabrics. This is a sleeve board. It's used primarily for pressing seams in narrow areas, such as sleeves. The tailor's ham is useful for pressing curved, shaped areas. This helps you press a body shape into your garment. A ham also is covered with wool on one side and cotton on the other. A tailor's board is made of hardwood and has differently shaped edges and surfaces. They're used for pressing flat garment sections as well as points and straight and curved seams. This is a point presser and pounding block. The straight point surface is for pressing corners and points. The block base is used to pound steam into fabrics so they lie flat and hold a crease well. Press claws are used to prevent iron shine. They're available in see-through fabric too. Sometimes a cotton towel or a linen handkerchief can be used as a press cloth. Let's look at basic sewing equipment. You're surely familiar with the tape measure. It's essential for taking body and pattern measurement. The best are made of flexible, synthetic, or fiberglass that will not tear or stretch. This 6-inch ruler is called a sewing gauge. The sliding marker adjusts to the desired measurement. It's ideal for hems, tucks, pleats, or spacing buttons or decorations at regular intervals. The yardstick is best for taking long, straight measurements. Some show inches and metric. It's also good for checking the grain of your fabric and marking hems. Be sure the surface of the wood is smooth so it doesn't catch and mar the fabric. When you need to transfer pattern markings to your fabric, you might want to use a tracing wheel with dressmaker's tracing paper. One type of wheel has a serrated edge. That's suitable for most fabrics. Another kind has a smooth edge, which protects delicate fabrics and is also good for fabrics that are hard to mark. Other marking tools include this tailor's chalk and this washable marking pen. There are many kinds and sizes of cutting tools. Scissors or shears, as they're called by professionals. When you're cutting out your fabric, use a bent-handled dressmaker's shears. The angle of the lower blade lets the fabric lie flat as you cut. They come in several lengths as well as right and left-handed versions. These are called embroidery scissors. They're useful for cutting threads, trimming, clipping, and opening buttonholes, for tight places where your larger blades can't fit easily. They also come in different lengths. Keep them handy at your sewing machine. Pinking shears cut a zigzag edge that is ravel-resistant, which makes them excellent for finishing the edge of many types of fabrics. You can find them in right and left-handed versions. You may think it's a time saver to use a pinking shears to cut out your pattern, but our advice is don't. In fact, don't use any type of scissors for a job it hasn't really been designed to do. Sewing demands precision and precision instruments. Always buy the best you can afford and take good care of them. As you become more expert, you'll rely on your own favorite scissors that feel just right in your hand and perform to your expectations. Think of them as your personal belongings, just like your fountain pen or your favorite chef's knife. Don't let anyone else use them. And use yours only for sewing, not for cutting paper or other things that can so easily spoil the edge of the blade. Protect the blades and points. With good care, you'll find they can last a long time. You'll need straight pins at every stage of your sewing, from pinning your pattern to finishing the garment. This is the standard size for dressmaking. It's good for light to medium weight fabrics. Straight pins can have flat heads or ball heads. These are easier to see and easier to find if you drop them. Every sewing project calls for needles and thread. We'll look at needles for hand sewing now and talk about sewing machine needles when we discuss machines. These are the needles you'll use most often. Sharps have a round eye and are suitable for almost all fabric weights. Betweens also have a round eye, but they're shorter, so they can take small, fine stitches in heavy fabric. These are embroidery or crewel needles. They're medium length and have sharp points. They have a long eye for easy threading. You want a supply of white and colored thread. Most all-purpose thread today is a blend of polyester and cotton, or all polyester. They come in a variety of colors and are suitable for almost any fabric weight. If you find it difficult to thread a needle, buy one of these little gadgets. It's a needle threader. To protect your middle finger as you sew, you may want to use a thimble. They come in a range of sizes. Find one that fits, snug but comfortable. And finally, to make sure you've got everything that's necessary to complete your project, check the back of your pattern envelope. Every notion your finished piece will require is listed here. So you see, all you need is a place to sew, space to press, and a small selection of tools that can be stored in drawers or trays, bins, boxes, an old bureau. And of course, you need a sewing machine. The next section, What Your Sewing Machine Can Do for You, is about different types of machines and how to make the best use of them. If you've already mastered your machine and its sewing techniques you're interested in, you can skip directly to any other portion of the program. Sewing machines range from the simple to the very sophisticated. As a rule, the more functions a machine offers, the more expensive it is. However, if you intend to make full use of its capabilities, the added cost may be worth it in the long run. Now we're going to show you in detail how a sewing machine operates. So why not get out the manual that came with your machine and relate what you see on the screen to the specifics of the machine you have. The purpose of a sewing machine is to stitch pieces of fabric together to form larger pieces. A plain, straight stitch machine will do for most sewing projects. This machine, designed over 40 years ago, is still sewing curtains, dresses, and jackets. Machines that are capable of zigzag stitching give you a greater range of stitches to work with. In addition to plain straight stitches, you'll be able to do plain zigzag stitches that can be used for seam finishes, sewing on elastic, sewing on buttons, making buttonholes, and to stitch seams in knitted fabrics. These machines usually offer several decorative zigzag stitches, as well as patterns that combine straight stitches and zigzag, such as the blind stitch, which is useful for hemming by machine, and the multi-stitch zigzag stitch, which is used for seam finishing, sewing on elastic, and mending. A machine with stretch stitch capabilities offers you even more diversity. These machines will do straight stitching and all types of zigzag stitching, but they are known for their stretch stitches, which incorporate straight and zigzag stitching with forward and reverse stitching. This forward and reverse action puts more stitches into a seam line on a knitted fabric, which gives the seam extra strength and prevents it from breaking when the fabric is stretched. We've all worn clothes with seams that pop, haven't we? The free arm is a relatively new feature, and it certainly makes it easier to sew in confined places, like sleeves, cuffs, and pants hems. And you can always convert the free arm back to what's called a flat bed for normal sewing. A sewing machine can look like a pretty complicated piece of machinery, but this video program will show you just how simple it is to use. As you get acquainted with it, you'll find it can be a marvelous time-saving instrument. Practice with your machine, following the examples shown in this program, so that you can discover the many tasks it can do for you. You'll find a drawing of a basic sewing machine in the booklet that accompanies this program. Compare the features shown in the drawing to the parts of your machine. The design may vary, but you'll find the essential elements are all there. The basic element of all sewing is very simply the stitch. Whatever the particular design of your machine, it is threaded on the top and bottom, and stitches are formed by the interaction of the top and bottom threads. Although the parts may differ in location and appearance, upper threading on any machine will follow the same basic sequence. First, raise the presser foot. This releases pressure on the tension discs, so the thread can pass between them. Then bring the take-up lever to its highest point. We do this so the needle won't come unthreaded when we begin to sew. Now place the spool of thread on your spool pin. Make sure the nick on the spool won't catch the thread as it's reeled off the spool. Hold the end of the thread. Pass it through one or more thread guides and bring it down toward the tension assembly, which on this machine looks like this. The thread has to go through the tension discs, which are hidden from view, and is then caught by the hook and thread check spring, which hold the thread in position between the tension discs. Now bring the thread up and into the take-up lever, passing it through a thread guide if your machine has one. Then bring the thread down toward the needle and through any thread guides in between. Pass the end of the thread through the eye of the needle to thread it, and pull at least 3 inches of thread through. The major differences in upper threading occur at the tension assembly. On this machine, the tension discs are visible, and here is the hook and thread check spring. On this third type of machine, you thread the tension assembly like this. Let's look at sewing machine needles. The upper part of the needle is called the shank. The lower part is the shaft. The back of the shank is flat, and the front is rounded. Here you will notice the groove of the needle. The eye of the needle is just above the point. Sewing machine needles come with different types of points. Most frequently used are the sharp points, like this. They're good for all types of woven fabrics. Ballpoint needles have a rounded point, which makes them ideal for sewing knits. These wedge point needles are designed for sewing on leathers and vinyl materials. This is what we call a twin needle. 2 needles are joined by one shank. This needle is designed for decorative sewing. To use it, you need a machine equipped with 2 spool holders and a zigzag throat plate, like this one. You can do straight or zigzag stitches with a twin needle. When doing zigzag stitches, be careful not to exceed half the maximum width of the pattern. Otherwise, your needle might hit the throat plate and break. To insert the needle, you first loosen the clamp screw. Then position the needle so that the flat side of the shank faces away from the last thread guide. Push the needle up into the clamp as far as possible and tighten the needle clamp screw. Notice, the position of the last thread guide tells you which direction the front of the needle must face. On this machine, the last thread guide is on the front, so the front of the needle, the grooved side, should face the front of the machine. If your thread guide is on the other side, the front of your needle will face that side. Your supply of lower thread is stored here, under the throat plate, in the bobbin area. It consists of a small spool, which is the bobbin, and a case into which the bobbin fits. A drop-in bobbin is easy to remove. You just lift it out. Bobbins come in different sizes and even different styles. They may be made of metal or plastic. Some have solid sides, and some of the metal ones have several holes in each side. Make sure that the bobbins you buy will fit your machine. Once you've got the right bobbin, you'll need to fill it with thread. How you wind the bobbin depends on the kind of machine you have. On this machine, bobbin winding is done on the top of the machine. Pulling out the flywheel disengages it and prevents the needle from moving up and down while you're winding the bobbin. As you see, the thread feeds from the spool, over through the bobbin winding tension spring, then onto the bobbin, which is in position on its spindle. When bobbin winding is completed, you push the wheel back in to engage the machine for sewing. With this machine, bobbin winding is done on the side of the machine, and the flywheel is automatically disengaged when you place the bobbin on the winder pin. The thread goes from the spool, through the thread guides, then to the bobbin. When the bobbin is removed from the pin, the machine goes right back to normal sewing. With a self-winding bobbin mechanism, you push this lever over. Thread the upper portion of the machine as usual, and wind the end of the thread around the presser foot screw. Set the machine for straight stitching. As the needle goes up and down, the bobbin rotates and fills. When the bobbin is full, close the cover and cut the thread. With this type of machine, you are now ready to sew. On other machines, once the bobbin is full, you'll need to thread the bobbin into its case. If your machine has a removable bobbin, hold the case and the bobbin like this. The thread should feed off the bobbin in the same direction as the slot. Put the bobbin in the case and grasp the thread and bring it to the slot opening. Now bring the thread under and around to the end of the bobbin tension spring. The case is now threaded. If your machine has a built-in bobbin case, the first step is to drop the bobbin into its case, making sure that the thread feeds in the same direction as the slot. Then grasp the thread with your other hand and bring it to the opening of the slot. Pull the thread back and under the bobbin tension spring. Then you can release the thread and let go of the bobbin. Your next step is to raise the bobbin thread. Hold the top thread with your left hand and turn the hand wheel with your right until the needle goes through the hole in the throat plate and down into the bobbin area. Keeping hold of the thread, rotate the hand wheel until you bring the needle up to its highest point. As the needle rises, a loop of bobbin thread will come up with it. When it does, pull on your top thread to draw up a larger loop of bobbin thread. Now let go of the top thread and pull on the loop of bobbin thread to bring up its free end. Finally, pass the threads under the presser foot and bring them back toward the right. Pull both threads until they are at least 3 inches long. In order to lock the top and bottom threads together and form stitches, the needle moves through a throat plate. The throat plate on this machine is a zigzag throat plate. It's also known as an all-purpose throat plate. Because it has a wide hole, it can be used for all types of stitches, and it must be used when making stitches that move from side to side, such as zigzags and some of the stretch stitches. On most throat plates, there are parallel grooves, guidelines to indicate distance from the needle. On some, the fractions of an inch are given at each end of the groove. This throat plate has guidelines on both sides of the needle. You may even find markings in front of the needle. For most of your sewing, you'll use the 5/8 inch guideline. When you set the cut edge of your fabric along the 5/8 inch mark, it will enable you to sew a seam that is 5/8 of an inch wide. This is a straight stitch throat plate. It has a small round hole, which means that it's used only for straight stitching. You may use a zigzag throat plate when you're doing straight stitches, but on fine or lightweight fabrics, a straight stitch throat plate helps to form better stitches. With many machines today, the throat plate is held in place by tension clips or magnets, and all you have to do is lift the plate off and snap it back in place. When you sew, the fabric moves through the machine. But the fabric also has to be held down flat as it moves, so that stitches can be set into the fabric. This job is done by the presser foot. There are several types of presser feet, and you can change them to suit the particular technique you're using. The basic presser foot, however, is the zigzag or all-purpose foot. Like the zigzag or all-purpose throat plate, it can be used when you're doing straight stitches. For zigzag and stretch stitches, however, it's essential. Many machines come equipped with a basic straight stitch presser foot. In addition to general straight stitching, it's especially useful for straight stitching on fine, lightweight fabrics. How you remove a presser foot will again depend on your machine. On many machines, the shank of the presser foot and the bottom of the foot are one unit. To change presser feet, all you do is unscrew one and screw the other on. To remove the foot on this machine, you just push the lever down. To put the foot on, position the foot, and then lift the lever to lock it in place. With other machines, the presser feet have snap-on interchangeable bottoms. The shank stays attached to the machine, and the bottom of the foot comes on and off. Here, you push a lever to drop the bottom of the foot. To put it on, you lower the shank and press down on the bottom of the foot until it snaps into place. The presser foot and the feed mechanism work together. When you lower the presser foot, the tension discs close to exert tension on the top thread, and the foot puts some pressure on the fabric. As you sew, the feed moves down and around in an elliptical path and grabs the fabric, feeding it under the foot. As the fabric moves, the threaded needle penetrates the fabric, and stitches are formed by the top and bobbin threads. The length of the stitches is affected by the distance that the feed moves the fabric between needle penetrations. You control this by adjusting the stitch length regulator on your machine. With this type of stitch length regulator, where the numbers read 6, 8, 10, 12, and so on, the numbers stand for the number of stitches per inch. The lower the number setting, the longer each stitch, and the fewer per inch of seam. For example, if the regulator is set at 12, there will be 12 stitches per inch. If it's set in the 20 or more range, the stitches become very short and tiny. The setting for your average sewing is around 10 to 14 stitches per inch. On this machine, the numbers on the stitch length regulator indicate size, the actual metric measurement of each stitch. For example, if the dial is set at 4, each stitch will be 4 millimeters long. If set at 2, each stitch will be about 2 millimeters long. With this type of regulator, the higher the number, the longer the stitch will be, and the fewer the stitches there will be per inch. For average sewing, you'll want to set your dial at about 2.1, which is equivalent to about 12 stitches per inch. To reinforce the beginning or the end of a row of stitches, we use reverse stitching. The control for reverse stitching may be part of the stitch length dial, such as this button here in the middle. When you push it in, the machine sews in reverse. Other machines have a separate mechanism, such as this reverse stitching lever. When you push it down, the machine sews in reverse. There are times when you don't want the fabric to move at all. When you're sewing on buttons, for example, you want your fabric to stay in the same place as several stitches are made. To do that, you deactivate the feed. On some machines, you can do this by pushing a button that drops the feed below the throat plate, so it cannot move the fabric. This machine has a button in the bobbin area. With other machines, you place a special plate over the feed to prevent it from moving the fabric. In normal sewing, 2 layers of fabric are fed under the foot at the same time. For a smooth, even seam, both layers should feed through at the same rate. This is usually controlled by the amount of pressure that the presser foot exerts on the fabrics. To see if your pressure is correct, do a stitch test. Take 2 pieces of fabric, match their edges, and pin them together at the bottom. Then sew them together. If neither layer forms a bulge at the pin, and if you were able to control the layers and the stitches look even and regular, then the pressure on them is correct. If a bulge formed at the pin, then there is too much pressure on the fabrics, and you should reduce it. If you found that you had no control over the fabric as you were sewing, and that the stitches are uneven and irregular, then you had too little pressure, and you should increase it. How you regulate the pressure will depend upon your machine. Some machines are designed to adjust automatically. With most sewing machines, you'll find a dial in the left end of the machine above the presser foot. Sometimes you have to open the end cover plate to get to the dial. And on some machines, you may find a push bar with a lock-release collar at its base. To increase the pressure, push the bar down. To release the pressure, push down on the lock-release collar bar. In general, you'll want to set your pressure in the middle range for most of your sewing. When you're working with a finer or thinner fabric, a lighter pressure is preferred. And for thicker fabrics, use a heavier pressure. Stitch tension is another important factor in your sewing and should be checked before you start any sewing project. To do this, do a stitch tension test. Cut 2 pieces of fabric, each about 8 inches long, and make a seam. When your tension is correct, equal amounts of top and bobbin threads are fed into each stitch. The result? Durable, well-made, smooth seams. When the tension is correct, the link formed between the top and bobbin thread falls right between the 2 layers of fabric. If the stitch links rise to the top layer of your fabric, it means you've got too much tension on your top thread. If the links fall to the bottom layer, there's probably too little tension in your top thread. In most cases, you can achieve a balance by adjusting the top thread tension. The top thread tension regulator is a numbered dial on or very near the tension discs. If you have too much tension on the top thread, turn the dial to a lower number. And if you have too little tension, set the dial on a higher number. For average sewing, a middle number will usually work best. If adjusting the top thread tension fails to give you the balance you want, see if your machine has a bobbin tension regulator. Check your manual for this information. If it does, it will usually be a tiny screw in the bobbin case, and you will increase the tension on the bobbin thread by turning the screw clockwise, and decrease the tension by turning the screw counterclockwise. When you're adjusting the bobbin tension, only the tiniest changes will usually be necessary. Adjustments on the bobbin tension should be made only if you find that you can't correct your stitch balance by adjusting the top thread tension. You've set up a place to sew, assembled the necessary tools, threaded the top and bobbin portions of your machine, and are getting a nice balanced stitch. You're ready to sew. Most of your machine sewing is straight stitching. The first thing to do is put on the straight stitch presser foot and the straight stitch throat plate, if your machine has them. Otherwise, you can use your zigzag or all-purpose foot and throat plate. Before you begin stitching on your actual garment, make sure the tension, pressure, and stitch length are correct for the fabric you're using. To find that out, do a stitch test. Set the machine for the correct stitch length, about 20 stitches per inch for light fabrics, 12 per inch for medium and heavyweight fabrics. Now stitch through both layers. Check the sample, and if necessary, adjust the pressure or stitch tension. The zigzag is another very useful basic machine stitch. As you see, zigzag stitches have a side-to-side width, as well as a stitch length. And these side-to-side stitches are very useful for seam finishes, for sewing on elastic, buttons, for making buttonholes, and for making seams in knitted fabrics. And you can use zigzag stitches to form decorative satin stitch patterns like these. Zigzag stitches can also be combined with straight stitches. Here we have a blind stitch, which is used primarily for hemming, and the multi-stitch zigzag stitch, which looks like this. It's excellent for seam finishes, for sewing on elastic, and for mending. The variety of zigzag stitches that you can create and how you make them depends on your machine. First of all, you must put on your zigzag or all-purpose foot and throat plate. On many machines, you'll have to set a stitch pattern dial for the machine to make zigzag stitches. On some machines, you insert a special zigzag pattern stitch dial, called a cam. The regulator that controls the length of your zigzag stitches is the same one that regulates your straight stitches. So if your machine is set for 12 stitches per inch, or for 2.1 on a metric stitch length regulator, you will get about 12 zigzag stitches per inch. When you're straight stitching, the penetrations of a needle are in a straight line. But when you change to zigzag stitches, the penetrations go from side to side. If you set your dial for a shorter length, you'll find that the zigzag stitches are set closer together. If you adjust the dial to a longer setting, the zigzag stitches will be further apart. We can also vary our stitch width from very narrow zigzags to very wide ones. To change the width of your zigzag stitches, adjust the stitch width dial. For finer fabrics, set your dial for shorter, narrow stitches. For heavier fabrics and fabrics that ravel, use longer, wider stitches. Before you begin sewing with any zigzag stitch, it's a good idea to do a stitch tension and pressure test. When your tension and pressure are correct, both layers of fabric will lie flat, and the stitching will be smooth and even. Now suppose you want to make a decorative or functional zigzag pattern. The same principles still apply. Following the specific instructions in your machine manual, set the pattern selector dial to the stitch you want to make. Or if your patterns aren't built in, select the cam for the particular stitch you want, and then insert it into your machine. Your manual will tell you how. With most machines, once your pattern is selected, you can adjust the stitch length and width dials and customize your design. You'll find that knowing how to use the zigzag stitch will broaden your sewing capabilities immensely. Many machines today can combine straight, zigzag, and reverse stitches to create what we call stretch stitches. As with zigzag stitches, you turn the pattern selector dial to the pattern you want. With most machines, the stitch length regulator controls the length of the stitches, and the stitch width regulator controls the width. On other types of machines, you'll insert a special stitch pattern cam into the machine. Before you begin sewing, you should test the stitch on your fabric, as we've done before. Although tension and pressure are not as crucial in stretch stitching as in straight and zigzag stitching, you should make sure that tension and pressure look correct to the eye. One of the most useful stretch stitches is the straight stretch stitch. The machine stitches 2 straight forward and then 1 in reverse. This results in 3 straight stitches on top of each other. It's a very strong stitch, good for seaming knitted fabrics. If a row of plain straight stitches is placed next to a row of straight stretch stitches and both rows are stretched, the stretch stitches stay intact. The straight stitches pop. Here are some other useful stretch stitches. Some are decorative. Others are useful in seams, especially over-edge seams, which we'll talk about later in the program. Let's look at some of the accessories you can use with your sewing machine. Attachments that are designed to save you time and work and give a more professional look to your garment. Of course, accessories will vary with the kind of machine you have. Make sure the attachments you select are specifically designed to work with your machine. You can usually find this kind of information on the package instructions. You may also want to contact your sewing machine dealer or manufacturer for a list of the available attachments for your sewing machine. One of the things you'll have to do very often is put in a zipper. Use a zipper foot. This is a hinged zipper foot that can be shifted from one side to another. To finish the edge of lightweight fabrics, use a narrow hemmer foot. It automatically rolls the edge into position for stitching. When you need to sew a button, use a button foot. Its size and shape will make it easy for you. Naturally, when you have buttons, you're going to want buttonholes. Some machines have a built-in buttonhole capability. Their special buttonhole foot has guidelines to help you make the same size buttonholes each time. If your machine doesn't have this built-in capability, you might use a buttonhole attachment. With it, you insert a special cam, and then make the size and shape buttonhole you want. When you want to sew an over-edge seam, which looks like this, an over-edge foot can make it easier. It makes the stitches set properly along the edge of the fabric. To do a machine blind stitched hem, like this, you will need a blind hem foot. Its special shape and built-in guide allows the fabric to feed through almost automatically. When a fabric has a pattern that you want to match carefully at the seams, this even feed attachment will synchronize the movement of your upper and lower fabric through the machine. One of the most important tools you'll be working with is a pattern and the instruction sheet that comes with it. Did you know that this page has a name? It's called a primer, and it tells you how to cut out your pattern pieces and put your garment together in a step-by-step sequence. Many people find that the pattern primer can be confusing because it assumes you already have a great deal of knowledge about sewing. In this next portion of our program, we're going to give you that necessary foundation. The next section of the program, Starting to Sew, Basic Techniques, is about different seams, seam finishes, and trimming and grading seams. If you're interested in special seams, you can go directly to the next section. Let's begin at the beginning. And in sewing, that means the seam. A seam is formed when you stitch two or more sections of fabric together. On a pattern piece, a seam looks like this. This pattern piece is already pinned to the fabric. You can see that you have a cutting line here. The cutting line is the one you follow when you cut out your fabric pieces. Your pattern also has a seam line here. The seam line is the line that you will stitch on. The space between the cut edge and the seam line is the seam allowance. It's usually 5/8 of an inch wide. Here, along the cutting line, you may see little notches, triangular extensions. These are matching points to use when you assemble your garment. As you cut out each garment section, make sure you cut out the notches as well. Beginning sewers might want to mark the seam line. Use your tracing wheel and dressmaker's tracing paper, one side of which is waxy. Put the tracing paper under the place you are marking with the waxy side against the wrong side of the fabric. If you use two pieces of tracing paper, you'll be able to mark both layers of the fabric at the same time. You'll have to get your pins out of the way to do this. Then remove the pattern pieces from your fabric. With the right sides of both pieces facing each other, pin them together along the seam line, matching the notches if there are any. Place your pins at right angles to the seam line, with the heads along the cut edges. You can also baste the pieces together for added security. Working from right to left, take several small stitches, each about 1/4 to 1/2 an inch long, through both layers of the fabric just inside the seam line. If you're left-handed, work from left to right. At the end of the seam, secure the stitches with a small back stitch. That is, take a stitch just behind where the thread came out. Then cut your thread. Now place the pinned or basted section under the machine, with the cut edge along the 5/8 inch marking on the throat plate. While you hold both thread ends to the right and back, put the needle into the fabric, and then put the presser foot down. Now you can stitch along the seam line to the end of the seam. Remove the pins as you go. Never sew over them. You could break the machine needle. At the end of the seam, and with the needle out of the fabric, lift up the presser foot and remove the fabric. Cut your thread ends, either with a thread cutter on the back of the presser foot bar or with a pair of small scissors. If you basted your seam, remove the basting stitches. Now, press your seam flat to embed your stitches and smooth out the seam line. And then press it open. Use your seam roll with a press cloth to cover and protect the fabric. The curve makes it easy to press only the seam line, so the edge of the seam allowance doesn't leave a press mark on the right side of your garment. The press cloth also protects the fabric, especially when you're pressing from the right side. If you need extra moisture, dampen the press cloth and wring out any excess wetness. Pressing each seam as you go along is the secret of garments with a finished, professional look. You may find that certain fabric pieces tend to stretch out or lose their shape as you handle them. There's a very easy way to prevent this. It's called stay stitching. It's simply a row of directional stitching, sewn on a single layer of fabric about ½ inch from the cut edge. You stay stitch right after you remove the pattern pieces from the fabric, using the correct stitch length for your fabric. By directional stitching, we mean sewing with the grain of the fabric. How do you find the grain? Run your finger along the cut fabric edge. The direction in which the lengthwise and crosswise fabric yarns are pushed together is with the grain. The direction in which they are pushed apart is against the grain. The most important seam lines to stay stitch are those that are curved or angled, such as necklines or armholes. If you are working with very stretchy or loosely woven fabric, you may want to stay stitch all of your seam lines. Once you've formed your seam and pressed it, you can choose to leave it as it is, trim it, or give it a seam finish. Let's look at some simple finishing techniques. Remember, always begin by pressing the seam flat, then open. This is called a pinked seam finish. All you do is cut along the edge of the seam allowance with your pinking shears. This seam allowance has a stitched and pinked seam finish. You do a line of stitching 1/4 inch from the edge of the seam allowance. Then you pink the edge. Both are attractive, aren't they? But they are not effective on fabrics that ravel easily. This zigzag seam finish is effective, and you can do it quickly. Set your stitch width for medium and give it a short length. Stitch near, but not on the edge of the seam allowance. Then trim close to your stitching. This is a multi-stitch zigzag seam finish. It's good for practically all types of fabric. Stitch along the edge of the seam allowance, then trim close to the stitches. For seams in an unlined jacket or coat, a bias-bound seam finish lends an especially attractive touch. Use double fold bias tape. It's available in a variety of colors. Here's how to use it. First, trim the notches from your seam edge. Then wrap the double fold bias around the edge, putting the wider side of the tape underneath. Now, stitch close to the edge of the top fold, making sure you catch the bottom fold in your stitching as you go. Depending on their location or their shape, some seams may need to be trimmed. This helps them fit more comfortably because they lie smooth. It also gives the garment a finer-looking finish. Usually you trim a seam when leaving the full width of the seam allowance will get in the way of fit, comfort, or additional construction. Armhole and crotch seams are a good example. Trimming simply means that you reduce your seam allowances by cutting them and decreasing their width, usually to half. In many cases, trimming a seam is a preliminary to grading a seam. When it's important for an edge to lie very smooth, and where several thicknesses of fabric are enclosed, as in collars and faced edges, for example, you'll want to grade the seam allowances. Seam grading means cutting your seam allowances to different widths. You first press the seam flat and trim the seam allowances in half. Now the seam allowance that will lie closest to the outer finished surface of the garment is left at half width. Grade the remaining seam allowances by trimming them to successively narrower widths. If there is interfacing in the seam, trim that down close to the stitching. Now press the seam open. Some sewers find it easier to do this before grading the seam allowances. Then press the seam to one side, away from the garment. Finally, turn the fabric right side out and press again, rolling the seam line to the underside of the garment. When you're working with seams that will be enclosed, you'll often find it helpful to understitch along the seam line. Understitching is a row of stitches sewn through the seam allowances and an underlying garment section, such as a facing or undercollar. It prevents the seam line from rolling to the finished side of the garment. After your seam allowances have been trimmed and graded, press open, then to one side away from the garment. Then, working from the right side, stitch through the underlying garment section and the seam allowances. The next section of the program, Techniques for Special Seams, is about ways to handle cornered and curved seams, double stitch seams, seams with fullness, darts, and zippers. You'll find cornered seams in many of the basic articles you want to sew. Inward corners, like this finished square neckline, are made of pieces like this, and they're pinned together like this when the seam is being stitched. Outward corners, like this finished collar, are made of pieces like this, and they look like this when they're being stitched. To illustrate the techniques of handling these seams, we'll be using this specially shaped piece of fabric. It has both an inward and outward corner for us to work with. Let's start with the inward corner. With right sides facing, match and then pin or baste the pieces together along the seam line. Begin sewing the seam, using the correct stitch length for that fabric. Now here, about 1 inch before you reach the corner, change your stitch length to a shorter stitch. Continue stitching along the seam line to the corner. When you reach the corner and are a seam's width from the opposite cut edge, leave your needle in the fabric and lift up the presser foot. Then pivot the fabric on the needle until the cut edge is lined up with the 5/8 inch guideline. Now lower the presser foot and continue stitching away from the corner. When you're 1 inch away from the corner, change your stitch length back to normal, and then finish stitching the rest of the seam. These shorter stitches on each side help to reinforce the strength of the corner. You stitch outward cornered seams in basically the same way, but because you want the corner to form a very well-defined point when the seam is finished, you take 1 to 3 stitches diagonally across the point of the corner. This technique is called blunting the corner. The number of stitches will depend upon the fabric. If you're working with a fine fabric, take 1 stitch across the corner. With medium weight fabric, take 2 stitches. And if it's a heavy fabric, take 3 stitches across the corner. On both inward and outward corners, the next step is to press the seam flat and trim the seam allowance in half. If there's interfacing, trim it close to the stitching. Cornered seams need to be trimmed or clipped so that they'll lie flat. With an inward corner, clip into the corner, just up to the stitches. This allows the corner to spread open when it's turned to the right side. Take care here so that you don't cut into the stitches themselves. With an outward corner, cut diagonally across the corner, close to the stitches. Then trim the seam allowances on each side of the corner, tapering them as you trim. The narrower your corner, the farther back you should taper your seam allowances. We do this to reduce the bulk, so the corner will lie smooth and flat when it's turned to the right side. After you've trimmed your seam allowances, you'll grade them. Remember that when you grade, you cut each seam allowance to a narrower width. Now press the seam open and to one side away from the garment. press the edge. If you find it necessary to understitch, begin and end your understitching at each side of the corner. Sometimes you will have to sew an inward cornered edge to an outward cornered edge, like this. To do this, you must first reinforce the inward angle by stitching just inside the seam line, 1 inch on either side of the corner. Now, insert a pin diagonally across the point where the stitching forms the angle. And clip into the corner, just to the stitches. Remove the pin and spread this clipped section to fit the other edge, matching and pinning both sections into position. Then, with the clipped side up, stitch on the seam line, pivoting at the corner. Press the seam flat and then open. Curved seams also require special techniques. There are inside curves, such as this round neckline. Here are the cut and matched pieces that make up the round neckline. And there are outside curves, like this Peter Pan collar. These are the pieces that make up the Peter Pan collar. Here we have 2 pieces of fabric with an inside curve and an outside curve. As in all your seam work, the first step is to match, then pin or baste your edges. Next, stitch them together along the seam line. When you're stitching a curved seam, shorten your stitch slightly for better control and sew slowly. Using the lines of your throat plate as guides, make sure that the entire seam line is the same distance from the edge. Then trim and grade your seam allowances if necessary. When you're working with an enclosed seam line, such as a neckline facing or a collar, you'll also need to clip or notch your seam allowances so that the curve will lie flat when it's turned to the right side. Clipping is done on seam allowances that curve inward. This helps the curved edge to spread open when it's turned to its final position. With seam allowances that curve outward, you're going to notch. Notches are small wedges that you cut from the seam allowance. By removing these little triangles of fabric, you reduce bulk from the enclosed seam, so that when the curve is turned out to its final position, it will lie flat and smooth. Then you press the seam open and press it to one side. Finally, turn your seam to the right side and press it again. As you press, try to roll it slightly to the underside. If necessary, understitch the seam. Here we have a special kind of curved seam, which joins an inward curve to an outward curve. To join an inward curve to an outward curve, first stay stitch the inward curve. Clip the seam allowance in several places, just up to the stitches. Now with the right sides together and the clipped side on top, match the inward curve to the outward curve, and then pin or baste them together. Stitch along the seam line. When you're finished, notch the other seam allowance so that it will lie smooth when the seam is open. Press the seam flat and then press it open. If you're making a princess seam, Press it open over a tailor's ham to give it shape. In self-enclosed seams, the seam allowance is hidden and has to be handled differently. This is a flat felled seam. It's very sturdy, good for sports clothing and children's wear. Because it's stitched on the right side of the fabric, it's also a decorative seam. So take care to keep the widths uniform as you stitch. Match your pieces of fabric, wrong sides together this time, and stitch on the seam line. Press the seam flat, and then open, and then to one side. If you have two or more like seams, make sure you press them in the same direction. For example, press both side seams either to the back or to the front. Now trim the inner seam allowance to 1/8 inch. And press the edge of the outer seam allowance under 1/4 inch. Stitch this folded edge to the garment. This French seam is the classic seam for shears. The secret of the French seam is that it's stitched twice, once from the right side and once from the wrong side. Again with the wrong sides facing, stitch the two pieces together, 3/8 inch from the edge, and trim the seam allowances to 1/8 inch. Press the seam flat and then open. Now fold the right sides together, and with the stitched line exactly on the edge of the fold, press again. Stitch on the seam line, which is now 1/4 inch from the fold, and press the seam to one side. Over edge seams are very narrow seams, about 1/4 inch wide, and they're useful when you want a seam to be flexible or to have the minimum amount of bulk. The double-stitched seam is especially good for knits, such as tricot or soft jersey, where edges tend to curl. If you can only do straight stitching on your machine, stitch a plain seam on the seam line, stretching the seam slightly as you stitch. This will add some give to the seam. Then machine stitch a second row, 1/8 inch from the first, using straight stitches, and again, stretching the fabric slightly as you sew. Now trim the seam allowances close to the stitching. Press the seam flat and then to one side. If your machine can do zigzag stitches, make a row of straight stitches on the seam line, stretching the fabric slightly as you sew to add some give to the seam. Then for the second row, place a row of zigzag stitches right next to the straight stitches. Since zigzag stitches already have some give, it isn't necessary to stretch the fabric as you sew. Trim close to the zigzag stitches, and press the seam flat and to the side. An over-edge stitch seam uses special stitches that allow you to sew your seams and finish them in one operation. These stitch patterns combine stretch and straight or zigzag stitches. These seams are especially good for knit and stretch fabrics. Start with a 1/8 to 1/4 inch seam allowance, pin-based if necessary. Then stitch the seam using a suitable stitch pattern. When done, press the seam to one side. When you have seams that cross, such as those at the waistline, shoulder, crotch, underarm, or faced necklines, there are ways to make sure they look smooth and professional. Crossing seams usually should be pressed open, and if necessary, seam finished before joining. While you're matching and pinning the pieces for seaming, Make sure that the seam lines of cross seams will line up properly after they're joined, and that all of the seam allowances will be caught flat in the stitching. Pin through both seam lines with a fine needle. Then pin both seam allowances on each side of the matched seam lines. If there are darts that cross, pin through both stitching lines. Then pin the dart flat in its appropriate position. That means either toward the center front or back. Stitch carefully. And then trim the cross seam allowances and the darts diagonally within the seam to reduce the bulk. Sometimes, when you join two pieces of fabric, one edge is longer than the other. Many times, the difference will occur within a certain area of a seam. Sometimes there will be just a slight difference, such as at a shoulder or elbow. Other times, the difference will be great, as along a gathered yoke seam. If there's just a slight difference, you can control it with pins. The back edge of this shoulder seam is slightly longer than the front. With the longer side on top, you pin the seam at the ends and at the notches. Distribute the excess evenly. Sometimes by rolling the seam over your finger as you pin, you can pull in this fullness more easily. As you stitch, remember to remove the pins when you come to them, and to maintain the fullness as you pinned it. When you're done, press the seam flat, then open. If it's been stitched properly, there should be no puckers or gathers along the seam, maybe just a bit of shape. When you're working with seams that need a little more ease, as in the elbow of this sleeve seam, notice that the difference in length really occurs between the notches or markings. You can control this amount of ease with one row of machine basting, placed just inside the seam line. Set your machine at a stitch length that's long enough for you to draw up easily on the bobbin thread, but not too long, or it won't control the fullness evenly. You may want to test this first on a scrap of the same fabric. Now, working on the longer edge, place a row of machine basting a thread's width from the seam line, between the notches or other matching points. Then, with the right sides facing, pin the seam at the ends and the notches. Between the notches, gently pull on the bobbin thread and draw the fabric up to distribute the fullness evenly. Pin to hold the fullness, keeping the pins within the eased area. With the eased side up, stitch, removing your pins as you go. Then press the seam flat and open from the right side. With gathered seams, there will be a great deal of difference between the edges. And again, you'll notice that the fullness occurs between the notches or other marking points on the seam. The best way to draw or gather a considerable amount of fullness into a much smaller area is with 2 rows of machine basting. Working on the edge to be gathered, stitch one row of machine bastings just inside the seam line. Now place a second row of machine bastings 1/4 inch away in the seam allowance. With right sides facing, pin your edges together at the notches or other matching points. Now draw up both bobbin threads and distribute the fullness evenly along the area. To secure your gathers, wind the drawn bobbin threads around a pin, figure 8 style. Next you pin baste. And then with the gathered side up, stitch the seam slowly, removing the pins as you go. Press the seam flat, just within the seam allowances. Do not press the gathers. Then press the seam away from the gathers, being careful not to crease the gathers. Darts are a basic structural element in dressmaking. With these stitched tapered folds, we can build a definite shape into a flat piece of fabric, so that it will fit over a contour or curve of the body. There are 3 types of darts. Regular darts, which you see most often at the bust, back, waist, hips, and the elbow in the sleeve. French darts occur on the front of a garment. They start wide at the hip and taper to practically nothing at the bust. And contour darts, which you find at the back or front of a garment without a waistline. They fit close at the waistline and taper off in 2 opposite directions, to the bust and hips, or shoulder blades and hips. You'll find darts marked on your pattern as a triangular shape, with stitching lines indicated on each side of a center or fold line. Along the stitching lines are dots, usually for you to match when making the dart, and there is a mark at the final point of the dart. Before you remove your pattern pieces, transfer all dart markings, stitching lines, center or fold lines, and matching points to the wrong side of the fabric. Use a tracing wheel and dressmaker's carbon paper to mark the fabric. With a regular dart, once you've marked the fabric, remove the pattern pieces. Then from the wrong side, fold the dart through its center. Match and pin the corresponding markings. Put a pin through one mark and then through its match on the other side of the dart. Then pin the 2 sides together. Then baste just inside the stitching line. Now starting from the wide end of the dart, stitch along the stitching line toward the point. Taking the last few stitches parallel to and a thread's width from the fold. Then make a few stitches off the fabric. Cut your thread, leaving 4 inches at the ends. With the thread ends together, form a knot as you see here. Insert a pin through the knot and then into the point of the dart. Tighten the knot, letting the pin guide it to the dart point. Then trim the thread ends and remove the basting stitches. Press the dart flat, taking care not to press beyond the point. This could crease the rest of the garment. Then press it over a ham. In general, you press vertical darts toward the center, front or back, and press horizontal darts down. When you press the dart over the ham, fit the fabric over a curve in the ham and press that shape into the fabric. When you're constructing a French dart, you'll once again transfer your pattern markings to the wrong side of the fabric. Remove the pattern pieces and then work on the wrong side. Stay stitch 1/8 inch inside each stitching line. Start each line of stay stitching from the bottom of the dart and taper both to meet about 1 inch from the point. Now slash through the center of the dart to the point where the rows of stay stitching intersect. If you remove the center portion of the dart when you cut out your garment, which some patterns call for, you can eliminate this step. With the right sides of your fabric together, match and pin the stitching lines, easing if you have to. Baste along the stitching line and remove the pins. Now stitch from the end to the point. Take the last few stitches parallel to and a thread's width from the fold. Then take a few stitches off the fabric. Cut the thread, leaving 4-inch thread ends. Tie them. Remove the bastings, then trim, and clip the seam allowances so the dart curves smoothly. Then, as with a regular dart, press it flat as it was stitched, taking care not to press beyond the point. Then press the dart downward over a tailor's ham. To create a contour dart, you'll again transfer the pattern markings to the wrong side of the fabric. Be sure to mark the stitching lines, the center line, and all the matching points. Remove the pattern pieces and, working from the wrong side, fold the dart along the center line. Match and pin your stitching lines. First at the waist, and then at the other matching points in between. Baste just inside the stitching line and remove your pins. Contour darts are sewn in 2 steps. Each time you begin at the waist and stitch toward the point. Start stitching inside the stitching line just below the waist. Then stitch along the stitching line toward the point, taking the last few stitches just a thread's width from the fold. Cut the threads, leaving 4-inch ends. Sew the second half in the same way, overlapping the stitching at the waistline. Tie the thread ends at both points of the dart as you saw before. Remove your bastings and clip the dart at the waistline to within 1/8 inch of your stitching. This relieves strain and allows the dart to curve smoothly past the waist. As before, press the contour dart flat as it was stitched, taking care not to press beyond the points. The back of the pattern envelope will tell you if your garment requires a zipper, and it will tell you what length zipper you need. The most common methods of zipper application are the centered application and the lapped application. If the zipper is to be at the center back or the front of your garment or project, a centered application works best. For a zipper in the side seam, a lapped application is recommended. Before you insert your zipper, pre-shrink it so it won't pucker after it's laundered. Simply soak the zipper in hot tap water for a few minutes. Be sure to let it dry thoroughly before you start to sew. If the zipper will be applied to a seam that has cross seams, at yokes or waistlines, for example, reduce the bulk of the cross seam allowances first. Trim the seam allowances slightly past the zipper seam line, and then press them open. Now, measure and mark the exact length of the placket opening, using the zipper as your guide. If you're going to put a facing on the edge, position the top stop of the zipper 1/2 inch below the seam line. But if you'll be applying a waistband or a collar and the seam allowance won't be turned down, position the top stop 1/4 inch from the seam line. In either case, mark the bottom of the placket at the point where the bottom stop of the zipper falls. Working from the bottom up, close the seam with machine stitching. At the bottom of the placket, backstitch a few stitches, then using machine basting, stitch the placket area. Clip both of the machine basting threads at the bottom of the placket. Then clip the bobbin thread at 1-inch intervals. This will make it easier to remove your basting later on. Press the seam open, and if necessary, seam finish the edges with an appropriate finish. Now, extend the right-hand seam allowance and place the zipper face down, with the top stop at its mark and the edge of the opened coil or chain along the seam line. Pin it in place. Using a zipper foot, machine base through both layers, about 1/4 inch from the edge of the zipper tape. Now close the zipper and keep the pull tab up. Extend the remaining seam allowance. Position the zipper foot to the left of the needle, and working from bottom to top, machine base the unstitched zipper tape to the seam allowance, about 1/4 inch in from the edge of the zipper tape. Now turn your garment right side up and spread it as flat as possible. Starting at the center seam, hand baste across the bottom and up one side, 1/4 inch from the seam line. Be sure that you catch the garment, seam allowance, and zipper tape in your basting. Then do this again on the other side. Now change to a regular stitch length. Beginning at the bottom of the placket, top stitch through all 3 layers, garment, seam allowance, and tape. Take 2 or 3 stitches across the bottom of the placket, pivot, and then stitch to the top. Now position the zipper foot to the right side of the needle and top stitch the remaining side in the same way. Take the same number of stitches across the bottom of the placket and then stitch to the top. Pull your thread ends to the wrong side and tie them. Remove your basting stitches and open the placket. To do a side seam or lapped zipper application, you first mark the length of the placket opening, using your zipper as a guide. If the garment edge will be faced, place the top stop of the zipper 1/2 inch below the seam line. If it will have a waistband, place the top stop just below the seam line. Working from the bottom up, close the seam with regular stitching. But at the end of the placket, make a few back stitches. Change to machine basting and sew the placket closed. Clip both threads at the end of the placket. Then clip only the bobbin thread at 1-inch intervals within the placket area. Press the seam open. If necessary, seam finish the edges. Extend the right-hand seam allowance and place the zipper on it, face down, with the top stop at its mark and the edge of the zipper coil or chain along the seam line. If necessary, pin it in place. Using a zipper foot positioned to the right of the needle and working from the bottom up, machine baste the zipper to the seam allowance, about 1/4 inch in from the edge of the tape. Now with the zipper foot to the left of the needle, turn the zipper face up, forming a fold in the seam allowance. Bring this fold close to, but not over the zipper coil or chain. Pin if necessary, and then stitch through all the layers. Now turn your garment to the right side and spread the fabric as flat as possible over the unstitched zipper tape. Hand baste across the bottom of the zipper and then up along the side, 3/8 to 1/2 inch from the seam line. Then position your zipper foot to the right of the needle. Top stitch close to your basting, across the bottom of the zipper and up along the side, pivoting at the corner. Bring your thread ends to the underside and tie them. Remove all of your basting stitches to open the zipper placket. Finish the top edge of your garment as your pattern primer tells you. Zippers may be top stitched by hand as well as by machine. The hand-stitched finish can give your garment the mark of careful craftsmanship. To hand top stitch a zipper, we use a prick stitch. It's a very strong stitch and it's easy to do. With the placket seam open, work from the bottom up on each side of the zipper. Bring the needle and thread to the upper side of your material. For each stitch, insert the needle a few fabric threads behind the point where the thread emerges, and bring it up about 1/4 inch in front of where the thread emerges. Dress patterns often call for a lap zipper in the side seam in which the placket extends above and below the waistline. The first thing to do is to whip stitch the zipper tapes together above the top stop. The length of the placket should equal the distance from the bottom stop to the whip stitches. Then apply the zipper using the same techniques as for a regular lap zipper. However, you baste along the bottom and up the side of the zipper and then across the top of the zipper. Top stitch in the same way, across the bottom, up the side, and then across the top of the zipper. In the last section of the program, Hemming and Hand Sewing Techniques, we show you how to hem garments by hand and by machine. We then go on to finishing touches. One of the last things you do on a garment is the hem. And of course, you must first decide where you want it to fall. So try your garment on with the underthings and the shoes you intend to wear with it. At this point, it really helps to have a friend there to help you. If you're unsure about a suitable length, fashions and hemlines change so quickly, put on a similar garment whose length you do like. Then measure up from the floor using your yardstick. Now, wearing your new garment, have a friend measure the same distance up from the floor and place pins every few inches along the desired hemline. You may have to pin and unpin a couple of times before you get the hemline even all around. If you're going to do the hem by yourself, a chalk marker like this can be a great assistant. Test the chalk first on a scrap of fabric to be sure you can remove it later. Then, stand up straight in front of a full-length mirror and move the marker around you. After you've marked your hem, trim the seam allowances within the hem to half width. This reduces their bulk within the finished hem. Then turn up your hem along the markings and pin in place. Baste along the folded hemline. How deep should your hem be? If the skirt is straight, 3 inches is usually allowed. On a flared or A-line skirt, the hem allowance is usually 1 1/2 to 2 inches. Use a ruler or seam gauge to measure the desired hem depth and mark it. Then trim the excess material along these marks. If the edge of the hem doesn't lie flat against the garment, the excess fullness must be reduced. We do this with ease stitches. Machine baste about 1/4 inch from the edge. Then draw up the fabric on the ease stitching slightly until the hem edge lies flat against the garment. Finally, press the hem lightly to shrink out any excess fullness. If necessary, place a piece of cardboard or heavy paper between the hem and garment so the hem edge will not be pressed into the garment. Your next step is to finish the raw edge, and then you will sew the hem in place. This stitched and pinked finish is particularly suited to fabrics that don't ravel very much. It's especially good for knits. Stitch 1/4 inch from the edge of the hem. If the hem needed any ease stitching, the ease stitching will serve as the row of stitching. Then, trim the edge with your pinking shears. For fabric that ravels, seam binding makes a clean finish. You can use a woven edge binding for woven fabrics or a stretch lace seam binding for knitted or stretch fabrics. Lay your seam binding on the right side of the hem, lapping it over the edge about 1/4 inch. Then edge stitch it. Use straight stitches to apply binding to a woven fabric. Use zigzag stitches when sewing on knitted fabrics. This turned and stitched edge makes a durable finish for articles that you will launder frequently. It's also good for lightweight fabrics and shears. It's not suitable for a very curved or eased edge. Turn the edge under 1/4 inch and press. Top stitch 1/8 inch from the fold. Hemming by hand is recommended for most of the things you wear. There are 2 basic methods, blind hemming and flat hemming. Your choice will depend on the fabric and style of your garment. In flat hemming, the stitches pass over the hem edges. With blind hemming, the stitches are placed between the hem and the garment. Blind hems are best for medium to heavyweight fabrics because the hem edge is not pushed into the garment as it can be with flat hemming. To do the blind hemming stitch, you work from right to left with your needle pointing left. Fold back the edge of the hem, fasten your thread inside it. Take a very small stitch, about 1/4 inch to the left in the garment. catching only a yarn or two of the garment fabric. Now continue, alternating stitches from the hem to the garment, spacing them about 1/4 of an inch apart. Keep your stitches small, especially those on the outside of the garment. A stitch that's good for heavy fabrics is the blind catch stitch. Work from left to right with your needle pointing to the left. Fold back the edge of the hem and fasten the thread inside it. Take a very small stitch, about 1/4 inch to the right in the garment, catching only a yarn or two of the garment fabric. Then continue to alternate stitches from hem to garment, spacing them about 1/4 inch apart. And remember to keep your stitches small. One of the quickest flat hemming stitches is the slant hemming stitch. Fasten your thread on the wrong side of the hem, bringing the needle and thread through the hem edge. Working from right to left, take your first stitch and each succeeding stitch about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch to the left, catching only a yarn or two of the fabric and bringing the needle up and through the edge of the hem. As you can see, this creates long slanting threads, floats, between the stitches. Another flat hemming stitch is the vertical hemming stitch. Here, very little thread is exposed, making this more durable than the slant hemming stitch. Work from right to left. Fasten your thread from the wrong side of the hem and bring your needle and thread through the hem edge. Directly opposite the point where you brought the needle through, catch 1 or 2 yarns of the garment fabric. Then direct the needle down diagonally so it goes through the hem edge, about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch to the left. Start the next and each successive stitch directly above the point where the thread came out from the stitch just completed. Short vertical floats will appear between the stitches. With a turned and stitched hem edge finish, one of the most durable and invisible stitches you can use is the uneven slip stitch. The stitches are slipped through the fold of the hem edge, so there's less chance of the thread breaking or fraying. Work from right to left. Fasten your thread in the hem, then in the garment at the opposite point. Take a small catch stitch, catching only a few yarns of the garment fabric. Now, opposite that stitch, in the hem edge, insert your needle and slip it through the fold for about 1/4 of an inch. Continue to alternate your stitches this way until you complete the hem. Hems can also be stitched by machine, if your machine can do the blind stitch. Machine hemming can be useful when you want to finish quickly, when you're working on children's clothes, sportswear, or things for the home. The machine hem is sturdy, but it gives your clothing a casual look, so be sure that is what you want. You can use any of the edge finishes we've shown, or simply turn the edge under 3/8 of an inch. Press. Set your machine for a blind hemming stitch. Consult the manual that comes with your machine for the proper settings. Lay the hem allowance down. Fold your garment back so that the hem edge is revealed. Now begin stitching, making sure that you catch just a yarn or two of the garment fabric in the zigzag stitch of the blind stitch, and that the straight stitches are along the hem edge. As always, press from the inside of the garment. There are other sewing situations in addition to hemming and basting when you'll need to sew by hand. We've shown you the needles and threads to have on hand. Why not work with us now as we demonstrate these last few sewing techniques? Many people tell us they've never learned how to thread a needle. Reel off a length of about 18 inches from your spool of thread. Cut the thread. Don't tear it off. And cut it at an angle. This will make it easier to thread. Then pass the thread through the eye of the needle. Transfer the needle to your other hand and pull the thread through about 5 inches. If that seems a time-consuming process, use the needle threader we showed you at the start of this program. Insert the wire into the eye of the needle, thread the wire. Transfer the needle to the other hand and then pull the needle threader and thread out through the eye of the needle. Before beginning to sew, make a knot in the end of the thread. Hold the thread between your thumb and index fingers. Wind some of the thread around your finger. Hold the thread taut. Slide your finger along your thumb. This twists the thread end into a loop. Slide your finger further back into your palm so that the loop slides off your finger. And then pull the thread taut to tighten the loop into a knot. At the end of your sewing, you also want to secure your stitches, and you do this by making a small back stitch. When you're finishing a garment, you may have to apply hooks and eyes. They are small, strong fasteners used most often at a garment opening, such as a waistband or neckline. With a lapped edge, the hook is sewed to the inside of the garment, and a straight eye on the outside. On a butted edges, both hook and eye are sewn to the inside of the garment, and in this instance, you use a curved eye. To apply hooks and eyes, you make a series of tiny whip stitches around each end of the hook and eye. To make a whip stitch, take a small stitch in the fabric, passing the thread over the metal loop, and take another small stitch under the metal. Continue in this fashion until you've completed the application. Then backstitch to secure your stitches. To secure the end of the hook, pass your needle and thread underneath until you come to the end, and then do a few whip stitches. You can sew snaps on in the same way. At each hole, whip stitch around the edge until they're secure. An attractive substitute for a metal eye is a thread eye. It isn't as strong as a metal eye, so it shouldn't be used in places where it's subjected to a lot of strain. To create a thread eye, just sew your hook to one edge of the garment and close the placket so you can mark the beginning and end positions for the eye on the other edge. First, make a few base stitches for the thread eye. Insert your needle into the fabric at one mark and bring it up at the other mark. Take 2 or 3 more stitches in the same way and secure it. Now, making sure you don't catch the fabric, cover the base stitches with closely placed blanket stitches. Start at the end where the thread is coming out from the base stitches. For each stitch, insert the needle under the base stitches and over the thread from the previous stitch. Pull needle and thread taut. Continue in this manner, packing the blanket stitches close to each other until the base stitches are covered. Bring the thread to the underside and secure it. If you're making a curved eye, leave some slack in the base stitches so they can curve. Here's how to sew buttons on by hand. There are 2 types of buttons, sew-through and shank. A sew-through button looks like this and is sewn flat to the fabric. It's best for lightweight fabrics or as a decoration. A shank button has a stem, and it's sewn to the garment at the stem. The shank gives some room between the garment and the button. These are especially good for medium to heavyweight fabrics. To sew a button flat onto a garment, take several small stitches at the mark for the button location on the fabric. Center the button over this marking and sew it in place through the holes. If it's a 4-hole button, you can sew through a pair of holes at a time. Fasten your stitches on the wrong side of the fabric. To sew on a shank button, take enough small stitches through the fabric and the shank to make sure the button is secure. Position the button so that the threads are parallel to the opening edge and the shank lines up with the buttonhole. Then fasten the thread. Now, if you want to use a sew-through button on a medium to heavy fabric, you can make a thread shank as you sew the button on. Simply lay a machine needle, pin, or toothpick over the button and form several stitches over it and the button. Remove the needle and lift the button away from the fabric so the stitches are taut. Then wind the thread firmly around the stitches to create the shank. When done, secure the thread and cut it. This video program is an encyclopedia of sewing techniques. As we said earlier, the instruction sheet that comes with your pattern tells you how to apply these techniques to the project you're making. Always read through the instructions before you start to familiarize yourself with the techniques you'll be using. We're using this basic dress to show you quickly how a garment is put together. First, stitch the darts in the bodice and skirt. We think it's a time saver to sew all the darts and then press them at one time. Next, use the appropriate stitch for your fabric, as shown in our section on seaming techniques. Stitch the side seams of your bodice and skirt. Give your seams a suitable finish, as shown in our section on seam finishes, and join the bodice and skirt, carefully matching the darts and side seams on each section. Next, you insert the zipper, using any of the methods we've shown you earlier in the program. We're using the centered zipper application. The zipper can now be top stitched either by machine or by hand. Apply the neck facing and interfacing. Trim the interfacing close to the stitches. Join front and back facings at the shoulders. Stitch along the neck seam line. Clip the seam allowances at intervals of about 1 inch. Press the seam open. Press all seam allowances toward the facing, and then press along the neck edge. Now, fit your sleeves into the armholes. You may find that the curve of the sleeve is larger than the armhole, as is the case here, and the thing to do is ease or gather in the fullness, as we showed you in the section on seams with fullness. Hand baste with small stitches, and then remove the pins. Check the sleeve from the right side to see that the fullness is evenly distributed and that there are no tucks. Start at the underarm seam and stitch slowly along the seam line. Trim close to the second row of stitching. Turn the seam allowances toward the sleeve. Do not press the seams. Try your garment on and mark your hem and sew it. That's the usual progression in making a dress. As you sew more often, you'll develop your own shortcuts, an order of doing things, methods that work best for you. We've reached the end of this program. Everything you need to know for sewing by hand or machine is here. You'll be astonished how quickly your skills will grow with practice. Review these lessons until you've mastered the techniques. Go back to them whenever you begin a new sewing project. Even the most experienced professionals need to refresh their skills. You can too. We hope you've profited by this program. Goodbye, and good sewing.